thanks to all colleagues. This is a really, really important exchange because I think we as think tanks should try to counter the tensions and conflicts in politics and between governments, and therefore our discussions is crucial. All panelists have been asked a number of questions, which I would like to address very briefly in my short introduction. And the first question was assessing the China-EU relations. And I see a trend at the moment in Europe, and that is the reason is China's relation with the so-called West are currently in a difficult situation. And one reason is the thesis that free world trade and close economic ties lead to a peaceful world has been shaken with the Russian aggression against Ukraine. The G7 countries have agreed on strong sanctions against Russia in response to the Ukrainian war and have set their sights on a rapid decoupling from Russian resources. And these reactions, these economic reactions, are increasingly being elaborated in Western capitals and in Brussels in strategic papers and concepts, and most of them are called strategic autonomy. And this discussion on strategic autonomy also affects the relations with China. And this is explained in the public discussions with the following arguments. They are not my arguments, but they are used in the public. And the first argument is the increasingly dependency on China's raw materials and technology is being assumed, as well as unfair obstructions of companies that want to do business in China. And the second argument, my dear colleague from China mentioned that already, is the geopolitical tensions in Asia, and Europe is irritated by that. And there's the fear that a military conflict could be possible in Asia, and people are scared of this. And this strategic autonomy discussion as a trend can promote, that's my fear, a deglobalization, which in the worst case leads to a de-multilateralism. And indicators for that trend are already seen in the Me First policy. We saw that in the United States with Donald Trump, with growing nationalism in many, many countries, and the collapse of international corporations instead of increasing number of like-minded alliances. And such a trend would be very, very bad news for global climate protection, for the fight against pandemic, and for overcoming poverty. So in my opinion, because the question is, what can we do as think tanks? In my opinion, the task of think tanks and of think tanks cooperation is to counter this trend by developing a new narrative of global domestic politics and a comprehensive approach for global problem solving. The second question was resume US-China climate talks. And again, a narrative of a global domestic politics is important for an effective climate policy, as also expressed by the Indian G20 slogan, One Earth, One Family, One Future. It is the common interest of all states and of all people to combat life-threatening climate change. And it is clear in that discussion, especially when you take into account the last 200 years, that the industrialized countries are responsible for the vast majority of CO2 emissions. And it is equally clear that per capita emissions in the G7 countries are much higher than in the emergency and developing countries. So this means a clear responsibility of the industrialized countries, particularly for combating climate change, and also that the industrialized countries have to pay for climate loss and damages. And from my point of view, it was a great success during COP27 that especially in that field, in the fund of loss and damages, we witness a first progress. But having said that, I would recommend all of us to say it is, of course, wrong to overlook the fact that also the very fast-growing emergency countries are making an ever greater contribution to current CO2 emissions. Denying this makes the international climate negotiations much more difficult. So I see the second task of think tanks is to mediate in this dispute, and perhaps we have to develop a way to reconcile the historical responsibility for CO2 emissions, the per capita emissions, and the climate damage caused by nation states and their economies, also for the emergency countries. As I said before, the purpose must be to achieve a common perspective and a new dynamic in climate negotiations, and not to insist on old arguments. The third question was the COVID exit and reopening of the Chinese government. China's opening up on COVID is, from my point of view, first of all, really good news. The Chinese government has responded to the frustration of many, many companies, domestically as well as internationally, as well as to popular discontent in China. Internationally, however, the radicalism from a zero COVID policy to dropping many measures has surprised. What the consequences will be is hard to foresee at the moment, because the development of the pandemic cannot be limited to one region, but also always has a global impact. In my opinion, the task of think tanks is to develop global strategies for pandemic control, and this includes a global health strategy and its financing as a global public good. And of course, the question was, think tanks is changed in 2023. I hope, and I think it is really, really important that we will return to more physical encounters. It was great that Henry Wang was visiting us in Berlin. And I can say in that round that the Global Solution Summit on May the 15th and 16th next year in Berlin will welcome about 1,000 participants from all over the world on a very, very high level. And we will try to develop creative solutions, including to the questions I just raised. And of course, our dear friend Henry Wang, all colleagues from CZG, and you are all invited. Thank you very much for listening to me.